Greetings, everybody. I'm Pastor Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas. Thanks for joining me for this episode of ATP Ask the Pastor. Real quick, if you have not done so, make sure and subscribe to the channel. Click that notification bell so you don't miss upcoming episodes. Also, make sure and give the video a thumbs up if you think it deserves one. And if it's helpful and you think it's helpful for others, share it on social media. All right, so today's question. Dear Pastor, I attended a non-denominational church where the pastor was teaching from Philippians 4. He stated that Euodia and Syntyche were women church leaders. Now, this particular pastor is a biblical scholar, but I've never heard of these women being called church leaders or ministers. Can I hear from you on this? All right, well, let's look at the text. So Philippians 4, verses 2 and 3, Paul writes, I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. And I urge you also, true companion, help these women who labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are written in the book of life. I don't see anything in the text itself that leads me to think of these women as leaders or as ministers of any kind in the Philippian church. Paul simply says that they labored with him in the gospel. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they had the office of the ministry or any sort of leadership role. In fact, based on what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 14, 34 to 35, and 1 Timothy 2, 11 to 15, they wouldn't have served in any sort of leadership capacity in the sense of preachers or teachers of the gospel. That they labored in the gospel, in connection with the gospel, along with Paul, indicates that they were active in helping Paul's ministry, however they could, which wouldn't exclude them from speaking to others about the gospel in their vocations, as all Christians are commanded to do. Now, there are proponents of women's ordination who argue that Euodia and Syntyche were, in fact, ministers. And the argument's based on the fact that when Paul describes the work of these two women, he's using the same terminology that he uses to describe others in the epistles who do share in the ministerial work. So they labored with him in the gospel, just as Clement did, just as the rest of his fellow workers there. Since Paul counts them among his fellow workers, his synagogue, it stands to reason then that they are ministers like the rest of those to whom Paul gives that title. That would be Epaphroditus is a fellow worker in Philippians 2:25. Timothy is called a fellow worker in 1 Thessalonians 3:2. Titus in 2 Corinthians 8:23, as well as Mark and Justus in Colossians 4:10 and 11. Being a fellow worker with the apostle and laboring with him in connection with the gospel, though, doesn't necessarily mean that they were fellow ministers. Paul calls Prisca and Aquila his fellow workers in Romans 16:3, and the scripture nowhere assigns them the ministerial office. 1 Corinthians 16:19 tells us that the church met in their house, but patronage of the ministry doesn't make one a minister. Paul also calls Philemon a beloved and fellow laborer in Philemon 1. I think Luther says it well when he calls Philemon a fellow worker, because he is in the simple work of providing for the saints, and because he shows hospitality to the brethren, but also because this pertains to the gospel. So laboring in the gospel can be serving in the ministry. It could also be supporting the ministry with money, with encouragement, with bringing others to the place where they can hear the ministry of the word. The word translated labor in Philippians 4:3 is the same one used in Philippians 1:27, where Paul exhorts the entire Philippian congregation to stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving or laboring together for the faith of the gospel. Euodia and Syntyche then are fellow laborers with Paul in the gospel in their support of the ministry, not by being ministers themselves. And their quarrel, whatever it's about, was hampering their labor in the gospel, their support of the ministry, which is why Paul encourages them to be of the same mind in the Lord once again. Now, I've also seen then John Chrysostom brought forward as a witness that Euodia and Syntyche were ministers in the Philippian church. He says in homily 13 on Philippians, "These women seem to me to be the chief of the church which was there." Now, the word that's translated chief there is kephalion, which it's not a designation of the ministry, it's a designation of honor. He goes on to say that Paul commendeth them to some notable man, whom he calls his yoke fellow, or true companion in modern translations, to whom perchance he was wont to commend them as to a fellow worker and fellow soldier and brother and companion, as he does in the epistle to Romans when he saith, "I commend unto you Phoebe our sister, who is a servant of the church that is in Cenchrea." Romans 16:1. So Chrysostom's point there is that as Paul commended Phoebe to the Roman church, entrusting her to their care, so he entrusts Euodia and Syntyche to a trusted companion in the Philippian church to aid in their reconciliation. Now, Chrysostom's comparison of these two women, Euodia and Syntyche, to Phoebe presents an interesting possibility of how they may have worked with Paul to extend God's kingdom. Paul writes in Romans 16:2 that Phoebe has been a helper of many and of myself also. Now, if we understand prostatis metaphorically, then we translate it as helper or support. But if we understand it literally, then a prostatis is a patroness, a person of prominence in the Greco-Roman world who would have had the financial means by which to support churches and assist ministries and missionaries. It's possible then that Euodia and Syntyche were patronesses of the Philippian church, just as Philemon may have been a patron of the Colossian church. And in financial support, again, is just one of the many ways that these women could have worked with Paul to extend God's kingdom. They could have shared in Paul's work by allowing the church to meet in their homes, by showing hospitality to the saints, by helping the poor and needy, again, by speaking the gospel to others in their vocations and bringing those others to the place where they would hear the ministry of the word. There are many men, or there are many ways in which men and women then can be fellow workers in connection with the gospel, but the sharing of that work doesn't necessarily imply that they're ministers. Chrysostom goes on, "Did women labor with thee? Yes, he answereth. They too contributed no small portion. Although many were they who wrought together with him, yet these women also acted with him amongst the many. The churches then were no little edified. For many good ends are gained when they who are approved, be they men or be they women, enjoy from the rest such honor. For in the first place, the rest were led unto like zeal. In the second place, they also gained the respect shown. Thirdly, they made those very persons more zealous and earnest. Wherefore thou seest that Paul hath everywhere a care for this, and commendeth such men for consideration." So for Chrysostom, these women aren't ministers alongside the apostle. They're helpers of the apostle, who should be held in high esteem on account of their support and their help of the ministry. Now, that Chrysostom doesn't think that they're ministers should also be clear from his other writings. He writes in Book 2 of his work on the priesthood, when one is required to preside over the church and to be entrusted with the care of so many souls, the whole female sex must retire before the magnitude of the task, and the majority of men also. He writes in the third book of that same work, the divine law indeed has excluded women from the ministry. And preaching on 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15, he says of women, "Let them not teach, but occupy the station of learners." So while Chrysostom seems to have thought Junia in Romans 16:7 was a woman apostle of some sort, that doesn't negate the fact that he clearly taught, along with Holy Scripture, that God does not place women into the preaching office of the church. So overall, Euodia and Syntyche, they supported the gospel ministry, as all Christians are called to do. Perhaps they served as patronesses of the Philippian church. Perhaps they were hospitable to the church. Perhaps they showed hospitality and care for the poor. And perhaps they did what all Christians are called to do, and they spoke the gospel to others in their vocations, just as we today are still called to do. I hope this helps. We'll catch you next time for another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor.